All right, welcome to a whole new episode of Colonial Outcasts, your semi friendly anti imperialist podcast where we collectively yearn for the dismantling of empire. As we continue to center the ongoing genocide in Palestine, we're going to branch out and draw some historical parallels between what is happening now and the attempted genocide that happened in Sri Lanka in the early to late 2000s. And if you're picking up on trends, yes, both the United States and Israel were involved, with Israel selling the Sri Lankan government fighter bombers and various weaponry as they committed atrocities against the Tamil people. Weaponized starvation, bombing safe zones, the destruction of infrastructure, including hospitals, libraries, schools, using white phosphorus on people. Sound familiar? So, to guide us through this sad chapter in modern history, we have Dishyanti Sachi, a licensed clinical psychotherapist and policy analyst. She has a master's in both clinical work and international policy from Columbia University. She specializes in gender based violence, including intimate partner violence, sex trafficking, and honor killings. She's American from New York and of Sri Lankan Tamil descent. She has been on CNN, NPR, Oprah Daily. She currently has a clinical practice in New York and Los Angeles. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm glad we could finally make it happen.
Thank you for having me. That's quite the generous intro.
We do what we can over here. And you were saying earlier that you did your master's thesis on peace, conflict resolution around the world, but with a focus on Sri Lanka. And you were at the UN when the war crimes investigation was happening in Sri Lanka.
Yeah, so, I've grown up hearing about the genocide in Sri Lanka since I was very little. 19 these were stories that we talked about in our dinner table conversation, so I always had an interest in why do these things happen and how can they be solved. So when I was at Columbia, studying, both at the social work school and the international school, you sort of were around people where you could actually have these conversations with for the first time, right? And peace conflict resolution is when these conflicts happen around the world, what are the mechanisms that can bring peace? So, what I did was sort of a global study of what worked, what didn't work. And being at the UN when the war crimes investigation happened was a really big deal. The close of the war was considered 2009. That was the final battle, sort of very similar to what you see happening in Rafah right now. It's almost like a play by play. It's really heartbreaking for me as a Tamil Sri Lankan to watch it because it's like watching it for the second time happening to a whole new group of people. And we know that Israel was involved in the military strategy in Sri Lanka, so this is no coincidence. But yeah, so the war crimes investigations at the UN was really sparked largely there was activism, but the media really played a big part and public awareness in getting that the UN, the international body, to move and say, hey, we need to do an investigation and document it. And they've documented it 3 times totally. And in that documentation, while they don't blatantly call it a genocide, under the definition of genocide by the Genocide Convention, which is, what we use in, within international human rights, everything is laid out for evidence that the Sri Lankan government committed genocide against the Tamil Sri Lankans.
Yeah. And before we jump into that further, I think for the benefit of the audience who may not be familiar with this entire subject, I have to
Sure.
do the subject matter intro monologue. So everybody strap in because y'all about to get hit with 3.5 minutes of straight up exposition. So let's go. In the late 20th century, the island nation of Sri Lanka, just south of the Indian subcontinent, for those of you who don't like maps, tore itself apart in a brutal civil war. Reductively, the conflict arose from ethnic tensions between the Sinhalese and Tamil citizens, but really the causes were much more complex and arose in large part because of Sri Lanka's colonial history. Big surprise, right? The British ruled Sri Lanka, then called Ceylon, from 1815 to 1948. When the British arrived, the country was dominated by Sinhalese speakers whose ancestors likely arrived on the island around like 500 BCE. Sri Lankan people seem to have been in contact with Tamil speakers from southern India since at least the 2nd century BCE, but Migrations of significant numbers of Tamils on the island appear to have taken place later, between the 7th and 11th centuries, Common Era. So in 1815, the population of Ceylon numbered around 3 million predominantly Buddhist Sinhalese and about 300,000 mostly Hindu Tamils. The British established a huge cash crop plantation business on the island, first of coffee, later of rubber and tea. Colonial officials brought in approximately 1 million Tamil speakers from India to work as plantation laborers. And the British, during this time, also established schools in the northern Tamil majority part of the colony and preferentially appointed Tamils to bureaucratic positions, angering the Sinhalese majority. This was a common divide and rule tactic in European colonies that had troubling results in the post colonial era in places such as Rwanda, Sudan, and in just about everywhere else that empire established a project. So it's basically the modus operandi was to empower a minority, have them rule over the majority, so they are completely dependent on the colonizers for their continued existential survival, and they would have to do all the dirty work for the colonial project XYZ. This is nothing new. It's pretty, again, it's standard for how European colonialism worked. Anyways, the British granted Ceylon independence in 1948. The Sinhalese majority immediately began to pass laws that discriminated against the Tamils, particularly the Indian Tamils brought to the island by the British. They made Sinhalese the official language, driving Tamils out of the civil service. The Ceylon Citizenship Act of 1948 effectively barred Indian Tamils from holding citizenship, making a stateless people out of some 700,000. This was not remedied until 2003, and anger over such measures fueled the bloody rioting that broke out repeatedly in the following years. And after decades of increasing ethnic tension, the war began as a low level insurgency in July of 1983. The Tamil Tigers, i.e., the Tamil anti government insurgent force, declared the first Elam, is that how you pronounce it? Elam
Yep.
War?
Perfect. Yep.
Okay. Okay, in 19 and it started and that went from 1983 to 87 with the aim of creating a separate Tamil state in northern Sri Lanka called Elam. Now, the September 11th attacks in the United States and the subsequent war on terror made it more difficult for the Tamil Tigers to get overseas funding and support. The United States also began to offer direct aid to the Sri Lankan government, despite its terrible human rights record over the course of the Civil War. And after a complicated saga of blood and violence, on May 16th, 2009, the Sri Lankan government declared victory over the Tamil Tigers. The following day, an official Tiger website conceded that this battle has reached its bitter end. People in Sri Lanka and around the world expressed relief that the devastating conflict, many would say genocide, had finally ended after 26 years, hideous atrocities on both sides, and some 100,000 deaths, probably more. So I'm going to play a brief segment from Sky News from 14 years ago that was published shortly before the hostilities finally ceased for good. I invite the audience to pay attention to the parallels between the Sri Lankan genocide, the Palestinian genocide, and just some of the sound bites you hear. Then we'll dive right in.
For Asia's longest running conflict, this is a significant chapter. For the first time since 1983, when the conflict began, Sri Lankan troops have seized the entire coastline. It cuts off an important escape route for the Tamil Tiger rebels. The rebels are now completely encircled. The military says this fire is a Tamil Tiger ammunition dump, set fire to deliberately to stop the army seizing it. The military claims it is readying itself for mass suicides of Tiger carders. As the last battles are fought, the human catastrophe worsens. No food, water, medicine or shelter. The dead left dying where they fall. The numbers swelled with each passing hour.
We have not eaten for weeks. I went from house to house to beg for a little rice. Everyone must live. Everyone must be rescued. Tell your leader to rescue our children. All the Tamils. I don't care even if I lose my life. I can't carry on seeing the way children are suffering. There are children without legs. Some are dead on the streets. After seeing so many, I've lost interest in life.
Charities describe the misery as unimaginable.
There are still thousands of civilians left there, and there are actually women with little babies, there are elderly persons, there are wounded and sick. They all need help, they need food, they need drinking water. There's no sanitary facilities on this spot where they are now. and the medical facilities are extremely basic, so they really lack everything.
This ship was said to have been used by the Sea Tigers, the rebels' naval wing. This video shows the secretive unit training at the height of their powers. These 3 children are claimed to have been rebel soldiers who have surrendered to the army. The rebels may be trapped, but they have pledged to die fighting. They have a choice, but the innocent civilians trapped in the bloody crossfire do not. It is they who continue to pay the heaviest price in this conflict. Ashish Joshi, Sky News, Dubai.
So yeah, I first discovered you when you were on Instagram when you were making a video about this, about the involvement of Israeli military strategists and how during the last days of this conflict they were straight up telling the civilians, "Hey, go here into a safe zone," and they were bombing safe zones
Yes, that was the
with Israeli
final.
fighter bombers.
Yeah. By the way, that was a really amazing and thorough recounting of the history. I was very
Oh,
impressed. And yeah,
oh, thank you
so
very much.
yeah. And just to add to the background for context, it was the island had 2 separate kingdoms pre-colonialization. So they had the Sinhalese and the Tamil people. So both people were indigenous, right? So we see parallels to this, to what's happening, just in Palestine. And when the British colonizers came, first the Portuguese and the British, they said, okay, you guys are all going to be one country now. And it created chaos, right? You saw the mass importation of external people, like the people from India, just like we had, Israel bringing in Jewish people from all over Europe into the land and displacing indigenous people. There's so many similarities, even leading up to that final battle of what we're seeing happening in Rafah and what happened in Mulivaikal in Sri Lanka. So the parallels are insane. So in Sri Lanka, when after exactly as you laid out, after we got our independence in 1948, the Sinhalese were the majority. The British had given that democratic vote where it's like, okay, one, instead of separate kingdoms, we're now a democracy. So everybody gets one vote. And they were able to sort of push Tamil people out of political positions, right? So you had, as you were talking about, the Sinhalese Only Act, where all the government documents all of a sudden were in Sinhalese. So all the Tamil people had to resign from government. They lost all their positioning. So you had what was called, you mentioned it, divide and rule. So the British people intentionally favored the Tamils, and the Sinhalese people were not happy about this, right? So it created internal division. And you see, you know, colonizers, the British in particular, having done this in Sudan and having done this in Rwanda, and the devastating consequences that are left after these colonizers leave the area. So the war that ensued, the resistance group that we had, which, like you mentioned after 9/11, were named terrorists. They, similarly to Hamas, right, are the resistance fighters that are named as terrorists. They were able to form, an actual army and navy and, air force, which is pretty amazing for a resistance group and very unusual. And there was like a full out war for that 26-year period. So that was formed after 20 years of peaceful protest in Sri Lanka. So like in 48, when the British left, and then you had about 20 years of peaceful protest to all these very discriminatory laws that the Sinhalese, kicking all the Tamil people out of government, kicking them off their land. That's when the resistance group formed, was in the 70s, when they said, okay, you're not listening to the peaceful protest, we're going to form our own military. And that final battle, which is what I spoke about in Rafah, reminds me so much. I mean, there's so many things about this situation where there are parallels, but the way that they have pushed people into what is called a safe zone, and it's a tiny strip of coastal land, just like in Sri Lanka. It's like this coastal land, and they are bombing them indiscriminately, right? You heard what just happened yesterday, um, with with the World Kitchen. That's the World Global. What was the name of the kitchen again?
World Central Kitchen. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, and they had provided, right? So Israel knows the coordinates of these different operations. And what they did in Sri Lanka as well is they got the coordinates of the safe zone. Like, okay, this is the hospital. We can't bomb this area. And then they specifically bombed that area. So this is sort of a classic genocide strategy. It is not an accident, where they say, oh, we didn't mean to do this. This is an attempt to exterminate a group of people. And there were cell phone videos, just like what's happening now, except ours happened in 2009. So Instagram was not a thing. But there were cell phone videos, particularly by British aid workers and journalists, and they put together this documentary called No Fire Zone: Sri Lankans Killing Fields, which aired on British television, which sparked and helped support the UN's involvement. So you saw the media at that time, it was television, play a really important role in international accountability. In what's happening with Rafah and what's been happening in the Palestine movement, it's very much social media. I mean, that's how I found you as well, because you have this amazing presence on social media. And you're breaking through mainstream news, right, which is only giving a small piece of the story, and giving people on the ground a chance to say, hey, this is what's actually happening.
Yeah. Well, we also see that mainstream media is completely compromised. I wouldn't
Right.
really say journalistic ethics is really coming into it. Especially, it's like they're for-profit industries, and they're beholden to special interests. And social media has kind of democratized the way information flows. I mean, there's being a massive campaign to censor it, but um, in the post 9/11 world, I wanted to bring this up. The Tamil Tigers being labeled terrorists when the government was using like the exact same like brutal tactics, that the
Right.
resistance was, because it comes down to like U.S. and Western definitions of what terrorists are, and on a basic level, this is reductive. States can't be terrorists, non-state actors. So if you don't recognize Tamil nationhood or Palestinian nationhood, and they're fighting a government against a government that you as the West is propping up, whoever resists is going to be called a terrorist, no matter their
Right.
tactics, no matter what their ideology is. That's just how it goes.
Well, again, in my home, it was always like, are they terrorists or are they freedom fighters? Right? That was the
Right.
biggest question. And we were always told, no, they're freedom fighters. They're fighting for our freedom. So I was living in New York. I'm from New York. I was born there when 9/11 happened. And at that time, it was George Bush's war on terror, right? Was the sort of politicized agenda to support what we were doing in the Middle East at that time, right? Which you could
Mhm.
probably speak to even more so than what I could. And they named all these different terrorist groups, which was any group that was against the government, no matter what the government was doing around the world. And the Sri Lankan Tamil Tigers, the LTTE, was named in that group. I remember, I was pretty young at that time living in New York, and people were like, "Oh, we heard about those terrorists in your country. We heard about the Tamil Tigers because the New York Times put out like this big article about it." And it was such a frustrating reality to know the real story. And what's been amazing about the Palestine movement for me is there's now a global conversation on redefining that word, right? Is the terror really inflicted by the state, or is the terror inflicted by the people who are trying to rebel against the state, right?
Well, yeah. So absolutely, I think going back to Bush's war on terror, in the military, we called it. I always hated this. The GWAT. It's the acronym for Global War on Terror.
Okay.
Um,
It sounds like
and
a
and
dirty
so
word.
I'm not a
GWAT.
fan. But the
Yeah.
GWAT, yeah. I mean, it was a dirty word that
Yeah.
hid dirty policy behind it. But
Right.
the thing about calling it a global war on terror, it's like, first of all, terrorist is a kind of like a thought terminating term, right? Because like, oh, they're just terrorists. They're just like radicalized individuals. You don't have to ask.
Yeah,
You know, they just like suicide bombs and like jihad or whatever. And so it paints all these different people from different parts of the world, different cultures, in one brush. It's terrorists. Like, so a lot of people are like, oh, the Tamil Tigers, like, how are they different from Al Qaeda? Or,
right.
the war ended before the Islamic State was created, but like, how do you differentiate that thing? They're all terrorists. And there was some conflation. If you're just like, hey, maybe we shouldn't be in Afghanistan, there was the same conflation, like, oh, are you a freaking terrorist sympathizer or something like that?
Right,
So
right.
it basically destroys all critical thinking, that word. I've always resisted it, even when I was doing intelligence analysis in the military.
Very interesting. The amount of times that I have been called a terrorist in the last 6 months, by people in my DMs on social media, by people that I know, just for speaking up for Palestine, because that is the word that is given specifically to brown people a lot of the time who are talking about freedom, right? And there's been like a resurgence of that word again. So it's it's really, I think, for the LTTE, and again, the LTTE, I do think, had a global impact on other resistance movements. They trained in southern India, but they also trained with the PLO in Palestine. So there was always this link in my mind between Palestine and what was going on with Tamils. And
Wait,
the LT
wait, real quick, how did they get over to Palestine?
That's a really good question. So it's through funding, right? And
Okay. Hmm.
because, like, I think the number is like 700,000 Tamil people fled the country, my family included. I mean, that's why we came to America. Um, my parents never wanted to leave Sri Lanka. They thought it was the most beautiful place and they had a good life there. Um, you know, the people who went to other countries, when their money, they had remittances, they sent money back to different
Hmm.
Tamil communities. So there was like a large diaspora population that was funding. They acquired funding from different people. There's some backstories about the Italian mafia and relationship between there's all kinds of stories about how the funding happened, but they managed to raise quite a bit of funds to do this training, to acquire an actual army and air force and some form of sea, some form of navy. So yeah, so they also were known for the suicide vest, right? So they
Hmm.
were the ones who invented, when you lift your hands up and surrender, that the vest goes off. And I think it is documented as having the LTTE resistance of having the most suicide bombers of any resistance group ever. Like that was their primary mode of fighting. So the question is, suicide bombers, okay, they're horrible people, they're suicide bombers, but what about the government that's doing aerial bombardment, right? So it's sort of like between the two sides, only the suicide bombers are demonized and are terrorists, but they don't demonize the huge bombs that are killing, infants and, all of those things that are happening. It's only one side that is described as the terrorist.
Right. And again, states which have air forces can't be terrorists according to the US definition, which
Exactly.
perforce is the Western definition. Um, but even if we're going to do a callback to Palestine right now. One of the main reasons that Israel says they're stripping and sexually humiliating all the men in Gaza and West Bank by like taking off their clothes is because they're worried about suicide vests and explosive belts. And it's like, dude, I went into the files of the Israeli war minister or Ministry of War. And all this stuff is open source in the public domain. It's like even they admit the last documented like actually Hamas suicide bombing was happened in 2008. So yeah, the if you try to connect terrorism to tactics, to specific tactics, even that doesn't fly in the context of Palestine. But and here's another thing. Those those 2,000-pound bombs that Israel's dropping in Gaza, yeah, that's obviously an act of terror because a lot of those are unguided.
Right.
According to the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, which is a U.S. intelligence entity that coordinates between like all the three-letter agencies and like military intelligence and JSOC and stuff. According to the ODNI, yeah, about almost 50% of the large bombs that they're dropping do not have guidance packages. So once they leave the aircraft, they just fall wherever. And you mentioned bombing hospitals. Well, the munitions that they are using guidance packages on, because those are more expensive. So if you only use them when you have to, and if you want to bomb schools, hospitals, and mosques, well, those are the guided munitions that Israel's using.
Right. So that is again play by play what they did in Sri Lanka. The same sorts of bombs that are not targeted. So a lot of
Mhm.
the images that we're seeing coming out of Palestine, which is infants, children without limbs, infants trapped under the rubble, the bombing of the hospitals. It's like a flashback for me, people crying over their dead family members of exactly what we saw in Sri Lanka. It was the same strategy. And yeah, I mean the images are like flashing through my mind, but it's if you put them parallel, it's almost identical. And the shooting of particularly young men who could potentially be fighters naked is also a tactic that they used in Sri Lanka. And in 2009, and this was also really instrumental in sparking some global concern, CNN aired a clip. I remember getting this, when it came out, of Tamil men who were not fighters, who were stripped naked, blindfolded, and shot in the back one by one. And this was like widely circulated. So, what they're doing in Gaza now is, not because of a fear of suicide vests. I mean, they do this to innocent civilians all the time in these situations.
Yeah.
So, yeah, the targeting of the hospitals in particular, there is one scene from the documentary Sri Lanka's Killing Fields, and you can Google it and watch it. It's a two-part documentary. It's on Channel 4 in the UK. You see them talking about and showing cell phone video of them having to leave patients on the floor. Some of these were makeshift hospitals while people are like getting bombed everywhere. When you bomb a hospital, you don't have a way to transport patients, right? And it's classic genocide because you're breaking the infrastructure. There's nowhere for people to go to get medical care. So you kill more people when you bomb a hospital.
Yeah, and I bring this up as frequently as I can just to get the message across, so people can argue against this. Like sometimes I'll look at very pro-Israel videos in the comments sections, just like, yeah, Israel's not committing a genocide because if they really wanted to, it'd already be done. It's like
I
no,
hate that
when
comment.
no genocide has ever been accomplished. Yeah, no genocide has ever been accomplished through the use of conventional weapons. There's just too many people to kill, and bombs are expensive. And if you want to do firing squads, that will work for a little bit, but then your soldiers will start drinking themselves to death and committing suicide because it doesn't matter how indoctrinated they are. You're still murdering innocent civilians, and that will have a psychological impact. So
Right.
even the Nazi SS brigades stopped doing that in Poland and Ukraine. So what do you have to do? You have to create a situation, a controlled situation, controlled famine, controlled disease like cholera, typhoid, things that,
Yeah.
can be cured with like clean water, but they don't have access to clean water and like electrolytes and stuff. So it's always these engineered circumstances in genocide. And that takes time. And honestly, Israel doesn't have enough time to do it, but they're still going to try anyways.
Well,
So yeah.
yeah, and it's very much, I studied the psychology of genocide because I am a psychotherapist by profession, and by degree. And you there's a piece around being able to commit something this atrocious and being able to sort of brainwash the psychology of the masses to think that it's okay in order to gain public support to do this level of massacre, right? So all of these messages that are given to the public are so carefully crafted, constructed. The war on terror that we talked about, the way everything is framed, it is so premeditated, right? Calling these people terrorists, but we're defending freedom in the West. This is all planned in order to sort of impact the psychology of the masses. So they will support something as atrocious as what we're seeing right now, right? I mean, it's incredible that anyone is still supporting it to me.
Well, there's a lot of, again, I keep bringing up like thought terminating cliches because like people are able to just repeat a thought terminating cliche and then go to Starbucks, or like shop at Zara again, because Hamas uses human shields. And
Yes,
Israel has a right to defend itself. And if it's going to defend itself, it needs to destroy Hamas. And if people get in the way, well, it's Hamas's fault. It's not our fault as the militarily superior and more advanced, I'm doing air quotes if you're listening to the audio, more sophisticated military. But they got in the way. As the occupying force, we don't have a responsibility to protect civilian lives. It's all their fault. They deserve it. And
right.
here's something that and here's an idea that I actually heard in the military from like admittedly dumbass dudes who could like barely read, but I heard this a lot, the idea that quote, it takes a village. They're
Right?
going to grow up to, yeah, they're
Totally.
going to be, yeah, it takes a village. Sorry, man. It sucks that that kid died, but it takes a village to
And
create a terrorist and to harbor a terrorist.
right. And what I see with my patients, because this comes up in sessions, I have a large amount of Jewish patients in my practice. I worked very closely with the Jewish community in New York. And so these conversations, and even just people who are not directly impacted, it comes up with every patient that I see right now. And there is sort of the large response I see is I'm kind of keeping my head down. I'm kind of turning away because it's too much for people to grasp. And they have something in psychology called the bystander effect. It was a really interesting sort of case where this woman in New York City, her name was Kitty Genovese, was stabbed to death in an apartment complex by her partner, and nobody called for help. And it was like all these different apartments. They had like hundreds of people who heard this happening and her screaming for help, and nobody called for help. And what they came out of that study was that when people are the bystander, they don't necessarily know if it's their responsibility to intervene. So it's a couple of things happening at once, right? So it's like, is this my responsibility to intervene? Is this too triggering for me that I need to turn away? And is there a dumbed down slogan that can justify my sort of avoidance of the issue? Okay, well, they're all terrorists. Okay, so then this has to happen. So there's a bunch of different psychological factors at play that allow something like this to even happen multiple times throughout the world.
Yeah. One thing I think that Palestine is different than Sri Lanka is because with the Palestine Israel situation, it's easier. I think it will be easier in the long term to motivate Americans and other Western citizens through self interest. It's like, Hawaii burned to the ground. We gave them 330 million to rebuild, which wasn't even a fraction of enough to because the wildfires earlier this year. But
Yes.
yeah, Biden wants to send another 18 billion to Israel. They announced it on April 1st on Monday. This past Monday, that another 18 billion to Israel to prop up their failing economy because Q4 of last year, after the outbreak of hostilities, their economy shrunk by almost 20%, their GDP, excuse me. And, according to their own internal reporting, by December 7th of last year, 500,000 Israeli citizens left and went back to their countries of origin.
Mm.
So we're having Israel doesn't really have any strategic depth, as we'd call it. Small country, their economy is really fragile, cannot survive a war of attrition. So we have to prop it up. So it would be nice. I try to get people to be like, wouldn't it be nice if that 18 billion that's going to this colonial project that's actively killing children en masse. We could have more affordable healthcare, or get rid of some student debt, or house homeless people. But or even conservative people, I'm like, wouldn't this be great if this just went to border security? Like
Right.
anything to motivate their self-interest. So I think that exists within the context of Palestine. Like I have zero confidence that most Americans even know what Sri Lanka is.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. They don't. They don't. They're
Yeah.
they're like, is that in Africa? Is that you know?
So
I
it's
mean,
it's so
I-
embarrassing, but
it's
yeah.
like, look, it's sort of, I understand because I grew up here seeing the education and it's never talked about. So how would they know? But so, so what you were saying is that you feel like Americans will be motivated to stop sending money there, you think? Is that what you were saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
just out of
I
self-interest.
I think, okay, so a couple of things in response to that is that by far our largest expenditure of our GDP has been the military, right? But I think for the people in America, now all the polls coming out are showing that people don't like what Biden is doing, and by and large they don't support what's happening in Palestine, right? And but it doesn't change the amount of dollars that are going to Israel, right? We see billions and billions continue to pour in, and it sort of made us really, it's very like blatantly clear. We've all kind of known this, people who have, like yourself, who've been in these conversations for a while. um how much of a democracy do we actually live in where our voice matters? um we are protecting, in the US, when I say we, are protecting our financial interest, right? Which is what's motivating this whole conflict, in my opinion, right? For US involvement. So they're going to continue pouring in the money for whatever the reasons are. There's a few reasons I could list why we're doing it, but I guess my point is that even though the public seems to have swayed in terms of not supporting what's happening, it doesn't change the billions of dollars that are going there, and it's incredibly frustrating.
Yeah, especially since this is a bipartisan issue, right? There's culture wars going on between the Democrats and the Republicans, but when you look at foreign policy and foreign policy expenditure, it's pretty much both sides of the aisle. They vote the same thing. First of all, because the Israel lobby bankrolls, donates a lot to Democrats and Republicans. So does
Right.
Boeing, Raytheon, these defense industrial contractors. And even if, some Republicans want to be isolationists, they're probably Christian evangelicals, and they need Israel to exist to bring about the second coming of Christ. This is
What
was what our last episode was on.
you
So
know,
there's a whole lot of stuff.
so as a Christian, right? It kills me to hear these things. I'm about to do a series on my page about why Christian Zionism has nothing to actually do with the actual Bible. These religious wars that are really weaponizing religion. So in Sri Lanka, actually, it was the Buddhist Sinhalese against the Hindu and Tamil Christians. Now, we in America, we think of Buddhism as being the most peaceful religion ever. Buddhism was used as a tool to allow a genocide. It's the same thing that's happening now, where they're weaponizing Judaism and weaponizing Christianity. I've actually read the texts for all of these different religions. I come from a half Hindu, half Christian family. None of them allow for what we're seeing right now. These are all political agendas, right? I'm going to have to listen to your previous episode because it infuriates me that they're using religion this way. um and I've worked in the Jewish community for long enough to know that none of this has anything to do with Judaism. I've had rabbis as patients, I've been in synagogue. None of this has anything to do with Judaism. So I think the frustration that we're dealing with right now is very similar. In Sri Lanka, it was China was bankrolling the Sri Lankan government. And whenever you have a seaport, so Sri Lanka is a little island, but it's a valuable seaport to access India, to go through Asia. Same with Gaza, is that we're talking about the seaport plus the oil resources, right, and gas resources off the coast. um you have these major world players getting involved. So the US supported the Sri Lankan government via Israel and then directly. And then China, so, like just like you see the Security Council's like call for ceasefire vetoed by the US. Um, China also was doing the same thing when there were calls for ceasefire in Sri Lanka. So these global players become involved because of their geopolitical interests, right? And then the people like not wanting this starts to feel less powerful. I hope over time, it does make a difference. But whether it's whatever world power it is that's allowing these atrocities, right?
Mhm.
And China has definitely been influential in Asia in terms of these allowing these atrocities.
Yeah, I mean they're guilty of their own stuff. Since October, I've mostly been focusing on Western imperialism. This doesn't mean that like Chinese imperialism or Russian imperialism don't exist. It's just the most visible genocide right now is being enabled, and you could argue directly supported by the Biden administration. So,
Yeah,
speaking about foreign funding, yeah, the second America labels something as a terrorist organization, or a faction as a terrorist organization, sanctions get imposed. So, because the Tamil Tigers were a terrorist organization, uh, they couldn't get the Tamil people couldn't get funding the same way. There's a lot more legal roadblocks to providing direct humanitarian aid. We're
right.
seeing the same thing. We're saying the same thing in Yemen, because if you recall, during the early days of the Biden administration, they actually took the Houthis off of the terrorist list from a foreign terrorist organization, which imposes a ton of sanctions. And
Yeah,
ever since they started threatening Red Sea traffic selectively, they got labeled a global terrorist organization again. And so that the
yeah,
same aid that was going to Yemen, which people rely on,
yeah.
a lot more roadblocks. So
And now they're close to famine. Yeah, the 2004 was the Indian Ocean tsunami. Do you remember the tsunami that happened in 2004? So
yeah.
that very much affected the coastal areas of Sri Lanka. In the north and the east, that's where the Tamil people live. They're really more concentrated up there, although they are throughout the whole country. And they did not allow aid. So, like, so many countries sent billions of dollars, and that aid did not reach the Tamil areas. And I was reading some of the UN reports on that, and I think in general, and this is not uncommon, of the aid that was sent, only 11% is accounted for. So all of that aid that comes from the UN has to get funneled through governments. And we don't know what happened to 9% of that aid. And of the 11% that actually reached the people, it won't go to the terrorist organizations, right? So it can't go to the Tamil areas. So yeah, it causes issue with sanctions, with concessions, right? With all sorts of things, and the distribution of aid, and just in general getting international support, right? The amount of times in my life that people are like, "Oh, you're Sri Lankan. I've heard about the Tamil Tigers. They're terrorists." The amount of times I've had to sort of just like kind of take a breath and explain, the situation, because of all this media political spin of what's actually happening over there.
Yeah, I think a lot of go ahead. Sorry.
No, you can respond to that. I just wanted to mention, you also mentioned sexual violence, but and I wanted to come back to that, but please respond.
Um so yeah, I think the word, luckily, terrorist, I think people are becoming exhausted by it.
Good.
It's robbed itself of like any meaning. I think it's a good thing. I think anti-Semitism as a term losing its meaning is probably dangerous for like a lot of people. But it just goes to show, if you overuse a word, people get exhausted, and it.
I hope so. I was just called a terrorist 3 weeks ago by someone from my hometown, so who
Oh
knows
wow.
me quite well. So I hope so, because of my support for Palestine. But I do think you're right that the general conversation is better than it's ever been, and the awareness is better. The piece about sexual violence, because that is what I really specialize in as a therapist and also in policy, the way that it is weaponized during genocide is also something worth highlighting, right? So, um, i- in Sri Lanka specifically, there is so many reports of the Sri Lankan army um, raping women and children, disappearances of children that we don't know where they went. You had I knew someone personally who went into the IDP camps and worked with the women, and there were forced abortions where women were forced. I mean, this is like literally textbook definition of genocide. They were forced to kill their own babies, to abort their own babies, I should say. Um, you know, so I worked with the UN in Sri Lanka when I was working at the UN. I went to the country office. I met with the UN people there, and they said, "Oh, we don't have sexual violence in Sri Lanka." And that's sort of Sri Lanka's stance. There's been no accountability for any of it. They deny everything. They refuse to. But we had a program that I had partially worked on developing for treatment for people who were victims of sexual violence, and they said, "Well, we don't need the program, we don't need the funding because there's no sexual violence here," right? So that is another parallel that I see happening with Israel and Palestine, and really happens globally. I mean, I've worked in sexual violence for a long time, where there is, two things. One, the denial of how much Israel has used sexual violence to terrorize Palestinians. Um, I've read reports of them, the boys they put in jail for throwing rocks. I've read reports where the IDF has said, we will rape you if you don't say that you threw rocks, or they'll squeeze their genitals incredibly hard until they confess, these forced confessions. And not to mention, many reports of rape, of the men and the women. And then you see the weaponization of rape, where they used it from October 7th, where the Israeli government put out all these statements as a way to justify the genocide. I'm not going to, comment on whether rape happened that day or not, because there's so much evidence, but we do know that a lot of the reports that they put out are false, right? That doesn't mean all the
Mhm.
reports are false, but a lot of them they've had to retract. The witnesses have been discredited. There's been a ton of reports that are false. So the sexual violence, the sexualization, the Israeli soldiers, like you said, going in and like holding up the lingerie. I recently saw a post someone sent me about Israeli soldiers posting themselves on dating sites while
Mhm.
they're with Palestinian detainees, like, this is something to be proud of, and that this is somehow like something that makes someone more attractive, right? So there's all these issues of sexuality that mix in with genocide, both the
Mhm.
violations, the political weaponization of it, right? And the sort of um, yeah, it's used as a method of terror, whether they are, you know, doing, sexually assaulting people or making claims of sexual assault. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and anytime you're going to see this en masse anytime you have a supremacist ideology in play, because a lot of these things, like the whole rape, the dating sites, the lingerie, it's not about like actual sexual gratification. It's about reinforcing pre-existing power dynamics. I
Right.
can physically dominate you and, you know, like trespass and violate, and there's not a
Exactly.
goddamn thing you can do about it. So, yeah.
Right. That's completely accurate too from a therapeutic perspective. When we work with people, we really separate, sex from rape, because rape is an act of violence, right?
Mhm.
So it goes alongside with genocide, and it's important to separate those two. And I'll tell you again, like as a female brown activist in this movement, I've gotten in my DMs calls to my phone, threats to be, for rape and things like that. So people
Mhm.
people have even used that to terrorize activists in the West who are speaking up for this movement, let alone what's actually happening on the ground there.
Yeah, and, these guys who do that, they're so unoriginal. It's like, "Oh, you need to, like, I'm not gonna repeat it on YouTube or, like, Spotify or wherever this gets posted, but it's more like it comes from
Yes,
a
it's
place
pretty
like
graphic.
like
Yeah,
yeah, it's very graphic, and it's also comes from a place that's like, you're stepping out of line and not obeying the power structure, so we're gonna weaponize this type of violence to, like, put you back in your place. It's about
exactly. So
domination. Yeah.
exactly, it's totally about control. So one, they're using rape to control. They have been using sexual violence to control Palestinians, just like they do with Tamils during this whole occupation and oppression. And then two, what's really difficult to see with Israel is how they've weaponized the rape. They've put out a lot of false stories, and again, there may be some that are accurate, but they've put out a lot of false ones as well, as a way of saying, well, look at the sexual violence that Hamas has done, and that is why we need to go in. This is why they're so terrible. So it's just this dual sword that's happening.
Oh, I mean, yeah, it's their old modus operandi of atrocity propaganda. 40 beheaded babies. I mean, when we were in the military, we engaged the Islamic State, and those dudes are like the single most unreasonable group of people on the planet. They still didn't like behead 40 beheaded babies, and I was just like, this is just so unbelievable. But I was shocked that people actually believed that that was something that happened. It again comes back to the we don't actually have to think about this critically. They're terrorists. Sounds like something a terrorist would do. So,
Right.
yeah, it's
And
just
it, and it, and
their
people
atrocity propaganda.
people still believe it. I still have conversations with people where that was reported by this one CNN reporter. Her name is Sarah Snyder. She issued an apology on social media. Nobody ran the apology. CNN ran it, but nobody really like spread it. But what spread was the initial reporting. And I saw videos of people on the ground in Israel, like medics and first responders, saying, "Yeah, we saw it." Right?
Yeah.
But didn't Biden say that he saw it and then the White House had to retract it? I mean, people,
I mean, he
it's
just straight up lied. He just straight
yeah,
up lied.
it's just like, oh yeah, and people saying they saw all kinds of atrocities, and then later it has to get retracted. So you have this. That's what I mean. Like you have the actual violence that's happening, and then you have the weaponization of it, where they lie about violence that's happening in order to create a false narrative, and it becomes very confusing.
Yeah, and I'm sure, the Sinhalese government put out atrocity propaganda about the Tamil Tigers as well, It's
Yeah,
just
I mean,
how these things
they
go.
they they sort of painted them to be terrorists, to be and look, there were violent means that they used for resistance. I mean, that is true, and there have been critics of some of their decisions, but there's no documentation of the LTTE having sexually violated um, women, but there is a lot of documentation. I mean, from Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, United Nations, like same like Israel of sexual violation of the Sri Lankan army. I mean, it was particularly flagrant in how they were sexually violating, particularly the women and children there.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Eh, I mean, we're seeing the same thing in Sudan, with the Janjaweed militias during that genocide as well. It's just a common through line because again, it's about
control.
supremacy and domination. Yeah,
Yeah.
and if you're trying to wipe another people out of existence, that's what you're going to get.
Yeah. Oh, I will say that the positive thing I've seen from the Israel Palestine movement, and you know, I've watched my people live through a genocide. I have, you know, tracked other genocides around the world. I think what's positive is I've never seen this level of passion, awareness, pushback. While it's frustrating, it hasn't stopped Congress. I just keep telling myself every great empire that fell started with, awareness, the dissension of the people, right? And I don't know how this will topple, but I'm hoping that all of this, the work that you're doing, the work that so many activists are doing, people on the ground in Palestine, what they're doing, will lead to a new order.
Yeah, and as a former combat veteran turned anti-war activist, I often bring up the Vietnam War, the Vietnam backlash. People forget the Vietnam War lasted 10 years, and
Yeah,
some of the most intense direct action activism protests, the intersection of many different activist movements, from the civil rights movement to environmentalists to anti-war veterans who came back from like a deployment and were like, fuck the rich man's wars, to people against the military industrial complex, to middle class families that just didn't want to have their children drafted. And it took 10 years of some insane activism where literally cops were murdering students on college campuses who were
right.
protesting.
Tiananmen
Like, it got
Square.
bad. And
Yeah.
it yeah, like Berkeley and the Berkeley shooting and stuff in Kent State. So 10 years to really stop the Vietnam War. Things happen faster now, but I know people are like frustrated about like, why isn't anything changing? These things do take time, so it's
Yeah.
about the marathon, not the sprint.
And even things like, the Security Council resolution passing, right? Now, I saw the US put out a statement that that's a non binding resolution. That is not true. The Security Council
Yeah,
resolutions are binding, they're legally binding. So the US is already trying to water it down because, it has, and a lot of people believe that it's non binding. I've seen that on a lot of pages on social media. Social media has been amazing for this awareness, but it's also, it's a double-edged sword, as I'm sure you know, right?
yeah,
With some of the misinformation that has spread as well. But yeah, generally speaking, I think it's fueled sort of versus Vietnam, where it happened for such a long time and there was a slower growth of awareness. It's like this, flash fire of awareness that social media has been able to create for this, right? So then people are like,
yeah,
we want the change now, but the change doesn't happen that way. But even that resolution passing, we never got that. It was always blocked. I think that that is passed because of the public pressure, right? The ICG case.
absolutely.
Oh, that was the other thing I wanted to mention. That's huge that they got two provisions. Now that case is going to take like 4 years. I mean, for it to actually make a statement. But that case, and I was just on that Zoom, I sent that to you, where Francis Boyle, who's, he's the lawyer who won the first ICJ case for genocide for Bosnia, in favor of Bosnia, he has written a book about the Sri Lankan genocide. He was on that call and he said, look, if there is this ICG case that happened, like Palestine has inspired Sri Lankan Tamils. There was this big meeting with all these global activists that said, we need to bring our case to the ICJ. We have all these same things and documentation. So I do think the Palestine, and it was a very hopeful call, for the first time in my lifetime to think, okay, because there's been zero accountability for Sri Lankan Tamils. The government has denied it. They won't allow the UN in to investigate it. For the first time, they're like, hey, maybe we can get some accountability from the ICJ, because that ICJ statement, I see on social media people say, well, it doesn't matter. It does matter. It's just, it's slow. It's a slow process, but it has been faster than most.
Mhm. Yeah,
So I think it's great how Israel is inspiring other groups of oppressed people to think, hey, maybe we can. I mean, that's what it's done for the Tamils. So Francis Boyle was like, I will support this case in the ICJ. You have all the grounds to win a case in the ICJ, and I will happily support, should the Tamils have a case at the ICJ um, against the Sri Lankan government. It would have to be brought by another state, another country, like how South Africa did. But
mhm,
yeah.
yeah,
So, I mean, I think those are the positives of what we're seeing in this movement. It's been, I don't know, for me, like, I think a lot of people are so devastated by what they're seeing, which I am as well. I mean, I've had like physical manifestations of this trauma. It's devastating, but I think it's also incredibly inspiring to see the global movement, to see a UN resolution passed, to see the ICG provisions. I mean, these are huge, huge steps still have not happened in the case of Sri Lanka.
yeah. I mean, a lot of this is unprecedented. Israel being held to task, even in a performative way, is completely unprecedented in history. So that I mean, a lot of this is bleak. The situation continues to deteriorate, but that that is something significant. So things are changing. Again, it's going to take time. And speaking of time, I think we're almost up. If you want to add anything else, any closing remarks about all of this?
Closing remarks. Actually, I have a question for you.
Sure.
Mike,
Yeah.
why? Because I was mentioning earlier that, um, that the ICJ, that what we're doing is not supporting the support of the financial support of Israel. Do you feel it's largely because, of the financial, because the gas off of Gaza, or because of, Israel being a military base for us in the Middle East? Why does it feel so difficult to move that needle?
I mean, Israel sits at a confluence of a ton of different special interests. So, you have the energy sector, you have the defense industrial complex, you have Israel lobby, you have the entire voting faction of 100 million Christian evangelicals in America who need Israel to exist to bring about the third temple and the second coming of Christ. You've got Saudi, a UA Gulf state interests that rely on Israeli spy tech to spy on their own people because there's nothing they fear more than the Arab Spring. It's a freaking can of worms. So that's why it's so hard to move, because there's so many special interests converging in the Eastern Mediterranean and the state of Israel.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, yeah, I mean, look, in terms of closing remarks for me, I think that we all just need to keep going, because I think this sort of push from the masses matter. I've already seen how it has, devastated Tamil Sri Lankans, but also the movement, to see this happen to another group of people. Even speaking with my mother, she's like, this is a nightmare. It's seeing it, it's like a nightmare that's repeating. But it's given us hope to see that the world is rising up, right, in masses, and that some of these international bodies are moving. So I think we all just need to keep going.
Absolutely. One goal mark or one direct action at a time. So thank you so much for coming on and talking
Thank,
about Sri Lanka and centering
yes.
Palestine.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for having me.
yeah, of course. Hey, y'all, I will link Dushanti's Instagram in the description. She does a lot of videos. Well, she does occasional videos on this kind of subject. So if you want to follow her, that would be great. And thanks again. We really appreciate it. And we will see you all next time.
Thank you
Cheers.
so